the signs to get there, and there's also a map on the back of your agenda. At the same time, on this stage, we'll be starting the day with just a small question. What should a vision for a political economy look like? That will be chaired by the fantastic Jess Elgott, Guardian Deputy Political Editor, and joined by MPs Chris Curtis and Louise Haigh, Professor Mariana Mazzucato, and Octopus CEO Greg Jackson. So without further ado, I will hand over to the panels. Thank you.
Yeah. Good. We're not doing speeches, are we?
I think I'll ask you to do an opening thought because.
Up there?
Oh, no.
Oh, okay.
No. Don't need
I
that.
think we no. Well, I was certainly told. I mean, my.
I don't know if the mic is on. Can everyone hear me? Great. Good morning, everyone. I am Jessica Elgott. I'm the Deputy Political Editor of The Guardian. And fantastic panel here today to talk about the future for our political economy. So if you were a young person in 1994, probably listening to Oasis, it's a bit slightly before my time, I have to say, you entered a world where the economy was growing by 2.5%. 93% of young adults could afford a starter home in their town, and the UK is experiencing faster productivity growth than the US. In 2008, just about around the time I was graduating, Duffy is at number one with Mercy, but the economy isn't showing much of that to graduates of my generation. The financial crash hits, that 2.5% growth shrivels to 1%. For the graduates of that year, real wages fell at about 8%. Look at this generation now, 2026, Sabrina Carpenter topping the charts. Espresso is on the radio, and we're just told if we forego one of those espressos, then we'll be able to afford a house. But home ownership for the under 35s has plummeted to just 35%, and productivity is now 20% behind the US. In all of those eras, we're talking about Peter Mandelson. But we're meeting here.
And Madonna's still performing.
And we're meeting here with the war with Iran escalating, and families at home being crushed by mortgage rates going in the wrong direction, energy bills still held hostage by the actions of petrostates and the whims of the White House. Labour's polling at 16%, I've seen today, facing a wipeout in the upcoming locals, and it's a progressive government that came in on a promise of change that people seem to not believe it can deliver. So how do we find new answers, new bolder answers to these seemingly intangible problems and not see voters turn to new parties when the mainstream seems to have failed so badly? On our panel today, Chris Curtis, co-chair of the Labour Growth Group, one of the party's most promising new backbenchers, fighting to keep the party relevant. We've got Greg Jackson, CBE, who's CEO of Octopus, whose green energy vision is coming a bit under attack by some of those both populists, especially Nigel Farage. Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary, a key voice on the Labour's soft left, leading the Tribune group, who wants to know, and who knows very much how restless those Labour grassroots are about change. And Professor Mariana Mazzucato, whose work so many of you will be familiar with, whose mission-driven approach to government has been so influential to this government. So it'd be great to hear, as we start from the panel, about what should a political project now be for, what's the purpose for many progressive movements, that many of them seem to be lacking at the moment, and what can we learn from the rise of populism? I'm going to start with Louise, who's going to make her opening statement.
Thank you, Jess, and fantastic to be with you all this morning. Huge congratulations to Praful and the team for bringing such an impressive group of speakers together. Unfortunate it's happened on such a slow news day. So I saw a stat yesterday that 42% of Labour Prime Ministers have sacked Peter Mandelson, so I guess we're destined to be speaking about it in generations to come. It's a crucial debate that we're having today, because questions about how the economy works and who it works for have rarely felt more urgent, and Praful laid that out very clearly this morning. Because for well over a decade, and Jess and I are clearly exactly the same age because I too graduated in 2008 as the financial crisis hit. And since then, voters have been sending the same message, that the system isn't working, that the economy feels rigged, and that their lives are not getting better. And we've seen it in the shocks that have shaped our politics since then, in the Scottish referendum, in Brexit, and in repeated demands for change at the ballot box. Now, no one in this room would pretend that change in the current circumstances is easy. And one of the things that I know Chris and I want to say today is that the Parliamentary Labour Party absolutely understands this. Despite what the media, or some in the media, would have you believe, we're not completely unruly and irresponsible. Yep. We are united in both our diagnosis and the prescription for the economy. We understand that the government is operating within very real constraints. Debt is now close to 100% of GDP. Borrowing costs are sky high, and that significantly limits the room for manoeuvre. To pretend otherwise is nothing short of deceitful. But this situation did not rise by accident. It's been the result of political decisions, particularly those of the recently revived centrist George Osborne. At a time when interest rates were at historic lows, he had an opportunity to invest, to rebuild our infrastructure, strengthen our public services, and raise the productive capacity of the economy. Instead, he inflicted austerity and entrenched short-termism in our economy and in our politics. A failure to invest alongside a massive increase in the national debt, locking Britain into an inflation-sensitive debt trap by issuing more inflation-linked gilts than any other major economy. The result has been the worst of all worlds: a balance sheet under pressure without the resilience or growth to offset it. It's why there is no simple tax and spend route out of the myriad challenges we face today. So the Chancellor has been absolutely right to focus on supply-side reform, on planning, childcare and energy, and to say that welfare spending has to get onto a more sustainable path. But we should not accept that all the limits we face today are inevitable. They are the product of political choices, which means they can be changed. So today, I just want to set out what I believe is holding our economy back and some principles for how we can begin to renew it. We know the challenges we face: weak growth, stagnant living standards, and an economy increasingly reliant on rising asset values rather than incomes. But the problem is we're responding to those challenges with at least one hand tied behind our backs. Successive governments have created frameworks that have prioritised short-term consolidation over long-term growth. From the way the OBR assesses policy, by favouring short-term costs over long-term gains, to the way the Treasury operates, and to the obsession with fiscal headroom over all other measures of economic health in our economic debate. We've built a system that is better at managing constraint than generating prosperity. And that is not caution, it's risk. We cannot deliver the change that people voted for if we're not prepared to change the system that is currently preventing it. And our fiscal, tax and economic strategies must align to support the changes we wish to make. Because politics ultimately is about choices. And as Labour, we must stand with those who work for their living, not those who live off wealth and assets. I chatted the other day with a lady in Sheffield who totally epitomised this issue for me. She works in the Amazon warehouse near Sheffield. She's grateful for the job, but she expected so much more. We spoke about the fact that one time, having a job at a major company like that would have meant job security, less worry about bills, and a few quid to enjoy the weekend with the kids. But that's not her existence at all. She's worked to the bone, too tired to enjoy the kids and constantly feeling guilty about it. Her husband works in another factory but has to drive for Uber at night, who are currently taking larger and larger chunks of his take-home pay every week. The owners of these companies don't live in Sheffield. They barely pay their taxes in the UK. They pay paltry wages and resist every attempt to allow ordinary workers to organise for their rights. Our tax system is on the side of those billionaire owners, whilst our neighbours who work in them feel abandoned and squeezed by the systems we govern. We need to ask ourselves the most simple question anyone involved in politics should. Whose side are we on? When a single individual can accumulate more wealth in 1 year than thousands of working households will earn in a lifetime, something is structurally wrong with our economy. It's not success we should punish, but it is an imbalance we must correct. So we must reform outdated and regressive property taxes, from council tax to stamp duty, and we must address the disparities in our tax system between employment and wealth. Second, we stand with businesses that invest, innovate and build for the long term, not those that extract value without creating it. It means confronting a system riddled with loopholes and cliff edges that don't just lose revenue, they undermine confidence and fairness in the system. It means reforming business rates and VAT thresholds to make it easier for firms to grow and take risk. Third, we must embrace an active strategic state, one that supports long-term growth and economic security, investing in the foundations of our economy, in energy, infrastructure, skills and innovation. And finally, we must reform the rules that govern our economy. We have tied our own hands, prioritising short-term fiscal targets over long-term growth, including the way the OBR assesses policy, focusing heavily on short-term costs while undervaluing the long-term gains from investment and reform. The fiscal framework that places a premium on narrow measures of headroom rather than the overall strength and resilience of the economy. And the system where the immediate cost of action is given far greater weight than the long-term costs of inaction. Yep. We have mistaken rules for responsibility, and until we change that, we will struggle to deliver renewal. Reforming these frameworks is not about weakening discipline, it's about strengthening it by ensuring our institutions properly account for growth, investment, and the long-term health of the economy. Because this isn't about abstract principles, it is about building an economy that works for the people who rely on it every day, workers, businesses, and communities alike. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louise. I'm going to turn to Chris. We know with from some of the overnight reporting, there's a good partnership between you two.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jess. Thank you to Praful and Louisa for hosting us today and everyone for sponsoring. I will try not to go over the same ground as Lou just did, but talk a little bit about why we wrote a joint op-ed in the Times today and have decided to come together to make some remarks. I think there are three lies that have increasingly, or three untruths, we should probably be careful about using the word lie at the moment, three mistruths that have crept into our politics, which I kind of want to address and put right. The first of which is that things aren't really that broken. So, you know, you see a lot of talk about in politics. Some people say Britain's just ungovernable now. The problem is that social media is convincing people that nothing works anymore when it does. I just don't think that's true. I think the reason that there is so much frustration out there in the country is not because social media is radicalising people in the country and the country has become ungovernable. It's because things aren't going that well. It's because we're now in our second decade of a decade of stagnation. You know, from the great financial crash onwards, we have not seen pretty much any economic growth of any meaningful sense in the UK. Modern democracies don't go through that without disruption, and that is why fixing it is of such great importance. The second untruth is that sure, things might be a bit broken and not doing too well, but there's just not that much we can do about it. It's just too difficult to fix these challenges. You hear this quite often don't want to, from government institutions or policy advisors, often from businesses as well, who push back and try and, often because they've been the big beneficiaries of the status quo, they try and push back against the changes that might be required to the status quo to fix the fact that we've faced 2 decades of stagnation. You can't change tax reform. You can't do tax reform, some of the things that Lou just talked about, because there'll be losers as well as winners. You can't change the way our energy market works because it might dampen investment. All of these are just arguments for protecting a status quo by the people that benefit from it. And it is only by changing them, changing the incentives, ensuring all of these systems work for creation and incentivize growth, that we can actually get our systems working properly again. And I think the third untruth is, okay, so things may be a bit broken. Okay, there may be things that you can do about it. But under this government, a government that was elected with a landslide victory, with over 400 MPs, it would just not be possible for us to get our will through Parliament because of those unruly backbench Labour MPs. And the reason Lou and I have come together today is to make the case that this just isn't true. If you put a vision together for how you want to change the country, how you want to put our governing systems on the side of working people, how you want to create incentives for growth and for investment, rather than just constantly ensuring that the only way to make money in Britain is sort of free riding off our past or by sort of holding on to assets that already exist. If you tell a story for do that, you can bring the Labour Party along with you and actually build a political project that can work and succeed. And there is a massive amount of agreement across the party on doing that and what we need to do in order to achieve it. From some of the things that Lou talked about, on tax reform, reforming our institutions in order to make that work. And my fear is that the risk of not doing this is so much greater than the risk of doing this. Firstly, we just cannot afford as a country another decade of economic stagnation. We just can't afford it. The NHS probably won't survive it. Your triple lock pensions certainly won't survive it. That is the consequence of not having an economy that grows as quickly as it was doing before the financial crash in 2008. But perhaps scarier still, as a centre-left social democrat, I know where we're going to end up politically. I was a pollster before I did this. Where we're going to end up is Nigel Farage ending up in government, taking this country further to the right, and putting in place loads of worse solutions which damage our society and don't solve that problem either. And if our response to this is not really accepting that things are broken in the first place, it's deciding that it's too difficult to fix, or it's deciding that the PLP won't let it, then that's where we're going to end up. And we need to come together with a political economy and a set of solutions that put our country back on track. It is not managerialism, it is incrementalism, it is the kind of reforming zeal and radicalism that is going to be required to fix our politics, fix our economy, and fix our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Greg, I'm going to come to you. Perhaps you could tell us a bit more about what you think has gone so wrong over the last few decades.
Yeah, look, first of all, I wanted to be able to react to what you guys have said, so allow me to assemble some thoughts live. I think the biggest issue that has become apparent to me, holding back growth, is the power of incumbency. And I don't just mean incumbent companies, although I'll talk about that in a second. But it's also the regulatory incumbency, institutional incumbency, and the incumbency of ideas. I think we live in a world which everybody knows we're seeing technology progress at the fastest pace ever, and it's accelerating. But if I give just one example of kind of the sludge that goes in the opposite direction, when Ofgem first regulated the energy sector, its regulation ran to 75 pages. It's now 1,200. Now, by the way, it doesn't take that long to read 1,200 pages, and thanks to technology, we feed into ChatGPT. The problem is that every one of those pages dictates activities that have to be undertaken within companies, an army of people, both within companies and within regulators, and every one of those sets of rules creates barriers to any form of innovation. So what you've got, I think, is this widening jaw between the possibilities offered by technology progress and, if anything, the rapidly decreasing pace of ability to use that progress to serve the people of Britain. And then let me give some examples. I mean, right at the beginning, the opening statement talked about households being stuck with an energy supply that exploits them, they've got nowhere else to go. Now, the reality, by the way, energy supply is just about the only good bit of energy, right? Because you've got companies that are responsive to customers, they have to compete with each other, the competition is vigorous, and the opaque pricing that used to lead to people being ripped off has been ended by the price cap. It's a sector where profits are limited to around 2%, which customers feel is reasonably fair. But it sits at the end of a chain where I can tell you my frustration. I'm a retailer of energy. If you're a retailer in supermarkets, if you're Tesco, the most important team in your business is the buying team. It is their job to relentlessly drive down the cost of the supply chain. They will be finding how to meet their customer needs at the lowest possible cost. They'll be finding new products and services their customers may like, and they will do that essentially driven by the competitive force they have against Sainsbury's and incumbents like Aldi and Lidl. But in energy, my entire cost chain is gifted to me by increasingly protected layers of incumbent companies. And so, for example, I think there are 3 times we've tried really hard to bring big-scale innovation that would slash costs for energy in the UK whilst making it greener. Every one of those was killed. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not that all our ideas are right. Although I can tell you we invested many, many millions in developing them, modelling them, and in often cases, seeding and piloting them. If I look at, for example, zonal pricing, right? Now, it was a big debate. The government chose not to. That's totally fine. We're in a democracy. We move on. But just to give you an example, zonal pricing would have saved £4 to £7 billion a year on energy bills. Right? Every model demonstrated that. By not accepting that, because we felt as a nation it was necessary to protect the model that served the incumbents, households are paying a lot more money. And I think when I look at sectors like energy, what's kind of really remarkable is, Louise mentioned Amazon earlier, I'm sure they could improve their employment policies, but Argos didn't get to lobby against Amazon. There was no God-given right for Argos or Debenhams to exist. But if we look at the highly regulated sectors, we've almost got Stockholm Syndrome now as a society, which is our job to somehow preserve them. Now, I was at a breakfast recently where you had a whole load of the energy incumbents. And it went around the table, we've committed 28 billion to investing in the UK. I was like, no, you haven't committed 28 billion to investing in the UK. You are going to receive £1,000 from every household and enjoy a guaranteed income for the next 20 years of 11 to 13%, more if you can financially engineer it. And so much of our economy is now held back by this kind of thinking. So I think for me, has anyone ever played the video game Asteroids? Do you remember? I'm so sorry, I'm 54 years old. It was big in 1978. In Asteroids, what happens is you shoot an asteroid and it breaks up into more pieces, and then you have to shoot those. And before you know it, the screen is just full of an unfathomable number of small pieces. And I think in many, many ways, that's the power of incumbents in our market, which, in many of our markets, which is every time we try to tackle one big problem, we have a bunch of workarounds. And then we have to tackle those workarounds, and it fragments to the point that it's the only thing to do very often, I think, is going to be wholesale, big-scale reform. If I can just throw in one other example, right? So I think we all know that, for example, companies that face the choice of listing their company, are they going to go public, can look at the UK or the US. I really hope that companies list in London. It's good for our economy. There's a real challenge for it because the London Stock Exchange has seen pension funds reduce the allocation of capital from 40-odd% of all the funds they allocate going into UK equities to 3% over the last 20 years, depriving the UK economy of enormous amounts of growth capital and our public markets, depriving our pensioners of the incomes they deserve, to the point that today a UK pensioner from the same investment will have roughly half the pension of an Australian or US pensioner making the same level of investment. Now, that's 20 years, by the way. This is not blaming this government. In fact, this government are looking to reform that through the pension bill, through Mansion House reforms and others. But all of these reforms are taking years and years and years. And in the meanwhile, essentially the £50 billion of tax credits that go to pensioners are subsidising overseas stocks. And companies like mine are going to be making Canadian pensioners rich, not British ones. And so I bring these together to say it's the forces of incumbency and the layers of regulatory barrier to change. Everybody stands to lose a little something. But we have to make those decisions in order we can all gain a big something.
Thank you so much. It's anything incredibly depressing, but... Sorry, do you want to... Thank you so much. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about the sort of bigger picture and how... what this means to voters and how frustrated they are?
Sure. So have you ever talked to any business person or politician who says they're not for growth? No. So we need to go beyond kind of slogans and better understand, first of all, what drives growth. And the answer is investment, and that's both public and private sector investment. But also historically, both in the UK and definitely globally, we should be learning from our fellow countries what has actually stimulated that investment. Because what we have in the UK is now an economy that over 3 decades, right? So there isn't, shocks. Yes, let's talk about shocks. But there's actually been a surprising inertia in this country. But 3 decades of low total investment. That's both public and private sector investment. Had we invested even just half the amount in the OECD on the public side, we would have invested $500 billion more in the last 2 decades. And we continue to have low business investment. So you'll remember how you can calculate GDP. You can either do it from the spending side, so C plus I plus G plus X minus M. The I bit is business investment. Or you can do it on products, the national income and product accounting, or incomes, right? Profits, wages, rents, and interest. So even though GDP is not a great measure, and we've all been thinking about how to go beyond GDP, even just by looking at the classic kind of old school GDP, you could see so much of what's happening in this country. So the business investment side has not only been low, but also falling at the same time that the profit share has been rising. That's the definition of a financialized economy. So high profits, but those profits are not being invested back into the economy. Just think of the stories from Thames Water, Carillion, and so on. Those profits going out to shareholders. Globally, by the way, this is a problem. Over $7 trillion have been used just to buy back shares, to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. But we are in the UK 26th. 26th. It's very low in the OECD for business investment. Okay, so the problem is obviously both on the public and the private side. And instead of talking about, us versus them, business, the Carillion model, which is wrong, we can go into that, but that would be a distraction. How do we actually change? And I think this is where the current government, with its 2 years left, forget the individuals, the actual government has 2 years left, could actually start really, really changing things and not sticking to this 3-decade model. And that's where the missions concept came in. And I was very happy that my book, Mission Economy, was cited when the government came in. They established these 5 missions. But then what happened? What was the first mission? Growth. Right? So yes, we're all here to talk about growth, but growth is not the mission. Not because we don't want growth, but growth is the result. Growth is an outcome. It's an outcome, as I just said, of public and private sector investment. When they went to the moon, and it's nice to remind ourselves about the moon because we just tried it again, right? Artemis circled around the moon. NASA did not say growth. They did not say de-risk the private sector. They did not say facilitate, enable, or we have to be business friendly, this word that comes up in this country constantly. They said, we got a lot of stuff to do. We got to solve what will the astronauts wear, how will they literally pee and go to the bathroom, and Artemis just this month had problems around the toilet issue, right? These are very concrete problems. What will they eat? And it was solutions to those problems that government boldly set itself to go to the moon and back in a short amount of time that fostered innovation, right? Because they had to innovate. What does innovation foster? Growth. What did we end up with? Camera phones, foil blankets, baby formula, home insulation. So think of our, earthly moonshots, right, around sustainable mobility. around, again, not growth, but growth as a result of solving health problems, the digital divide, energy access, but also beyond energy, again, sustainability across our food systems, again, what we wear, how we move, what we eat, and so on. This could foster growth. Why is it not fostering growth? Because the government, the current government, but also the previous governments, have not had that same kind of confidence, but also vision and strategy that NASA did, but also some governments do right now. And I can talk about Brazil in a second. But what does that then mean? What am I exactly saying? It's not just about the vision and the mission. It's the confidence to get the contracts right. And everything is a contract, a procurement contract, right? Over 30% of government budgets is buying stuff. The first thing NASA did, by the way, was change procurement away from cost plus towards outcomes-oriented procurement. Procurement in this country, like in every country, is a huge lever that governments could use to create a market, not to fix market failures, which is kind of the old school way that economists talk about government. At worst, get out of the way. At best, fix something. So by design, you're kind of too little, too late. So procurement, public loans, subsidies, guarantees, bailouts during COVID could have, and didn't, could have stimulated investment towards goal accomplished. During COVID, what did we do here? We gave bailouts. We gave, for example, $600 million to EasyJet, no conditions attached. What did they do in France? Both Air France and Renault received support because companies needed support right away, right? You don't want all these regulatory and laws maybe getting in the way. They needed the support right away, but they had the boldness to actually say if and only if you reduce your carbon emissions. What have they done in Germany in recent years? They've had a strategy called the Energiewende. That meant that their public loan system was conditional. The steel sector, which in this country often asks for help, to be bailed out in different ways. In Germany, they also did, but the government had the confidence. The government had the confidence to say only if you reduce the material content of production. Not interested? Go back at the end of the queue. Interested? Let's see what the solutions are. They didn't tell them what to do. If you tell business what to do, you kill innovation, you kill entrepreneurship, but you have the confidence to set a direction. Why is there green steel in Germany? Because that was the condition to the loan. They decided how to do it, repurpose, reuse, recycle. Another example, and I had the honor to help make this happen with the Biden administration, Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, said, we have a problem. We are completely over-reliant on chips made in Asia. We need chip sovereignty, so the CHIPS Act. And we worked together to make sure that that act wasn't just a giveaway, as what happened with Silicon Valley, right, where all your technologies and your iPhones were state-funded, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, and yet the profits all went private. She said, this time it'll be different. We're going to make sure that all the profits that are generated from a $400 billion government, basically subsidy program, are first of all reinvested back in. So no share buybacks. Second, you're going to improve working conditions and worker pay. And third, you'll use energy-efficient supply chains. Again, not interested, go back to the end of the queue. How you do it, up to you. So that idea of having the confidence to set a direction, again, growth is not the missions, it's the direction around health, energy, digital, and so on, to then foster symbiotic and not parasitic public-private partnerships. NASA, by the way, in the contracts with the 400,000 people in the private sector they went to the moon with, said no excess profits. That's confidence. No rents. Adam Smith, free market, was free from rent, right? We want you, exactly as you've all said, to have creative destruction, productive capital, not financialization. But that doesn't happen just by talking about it. It means getting busy to make sure that whether it's the National Wealth Fund, procurement, GB Energy, the way we also do our fiscal rules, tax policy, are all working together as an ecosystem of tools to redirect the economy. And I'll just finish by saying that if you don't do that, then at best you get conferences that talk about growth, talk about productivity, talk about jobs, R&D, but don't actually get you there because it's not the words, it's literally the structures. And unless you have a civil service that isn't told constantly, as they were with Cameron, where he said civil servants are the enemies of enterprise, or more recently, unfortunately, even with this government, one of the first things that was said was that they were somehow the barrier to growth. Unless we have a civil service that is invested in, instead of outsourced to, say, Deloitte during COVID, where we gave them $1.5 million a day to do something they had no clue about, which was test and trace, unless we actually really reform the civil service, not by cutting it, by investing within to have more agile, flexible, bureaucracies instead of just blaming regulations or red tape and so on, then none of this can happen. Because to govern these wicked challenges, you need public and private working together confidently with those dynamic capabilities that we need. And that also has not really been happening recently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we can also see it happening a few hundred yards away. There's in the committee room, there's a demonstration of what happens when sometimes civil servants do take risks to follow ministers' instructions, and then they end up where they end up. I want to ask Chris and Lou a bit more about, lots of the analysis that we've been talking today, this has been available to the government for a long time, right? People know what the problems are, and it feels like there has still been this kind of vacuum at the centre of an insufficient vision or radical will to make these changes. And I want to ask you, what do you think is the original sin of the constraints this government is on? Is it the fiscal rules? Is it the tax pledge? Is it the fact, you talked about, Chris, that the PLP is willing to make difficult decisions? Well, we've seen that the PLP is often very resistant to difficult decisions, whether that's welfare, perhaps what's coming up on immigration. Even if those things were the wrong decisions by the government, it's led to this perception, and I think also from the markets, that the PLP are unwilling to do difficult things. I'd like to hear from both of you on those issues.
Well, I think, on that last point first, that's one of the major reasons why Chris and I have decided to announce we're getting married. Spoken out and mentioned welfare particularly because we believe that the government and the markets drew the wrong lesson from the welfare debacle last year, in that a rushed set of self-defeating proposals were put to Parliament and put to the PLP precisely to meet that obsession with fiscal headroom that I spoke about in my opening remarks. It was to meet a forecast that we know is likely to be extremely shaky and will almost certainly be undermined and chopped and changed every 6 months, to meet figures that might drive down short-term costs on welfare, but almost certainly would lead to pushing up costs elsewhere in the system, be it onto local authorities or onto healthcare, or pushing people further into economic inactivity. That doesn't mean that the PLP doesn't accept that welfare spending is unsustainable. Of course it is, and the projections are inconceivable at the moment. So we really want to encourage the government to come back and engage with the PLP and look how we can drive welfare onto a sustainable footing. To the point, to your first part of your question, Jess, I think at times we have been guilty of treating the fiscal rules as the objective, rather than designing our fiscal strategy, tax strategy, and economic strategy to achieve the objective. And that goes back to your point, Mariana, about the first mission being growth, when actually we should have been thinking about what we wanted to achieve with that growth. People, as Praful said at the beginning, can actually be alienated further when we see GDP rising, and we need to be looking at how we materially improve people's lives, both economically, but also with the kind of lives that they want to then enjoy with that economy. And that goes back to that original socialist principle of giving people free time and the material improvements in their life to enjoy that time.
I won't repeat the welfare point, other than to say, it is not just unsustainable, the welfare system, it's unacceptable. Completely unacceptable to have so many people, particularly under a Labour government, who are out of work, not able to live their full potential in life. And it is, I think, a defining importance of our movement to build a country where fewer people are living on welfare. And again, as Louise said, it was just the complete wrong lessons that were drawn from that. And we should have come out the day after and said, yes, these proposals were the wrong proposals, but that doesn't mean that we should accept the direction of travel on welfare, and we do need to do many things, some of which the government has done, but we need to do more in order to bring down that bill.
What about the tax pledge?
Just on the we shouldn't have done the tax pledge in the election campaign, if only because it didn't probably didn't win us a single vote. It was a pollster at the time. All of the polling and focus groups said that, and it was the wrong decision to do it. And you could never predict the future, and you should never be making commitments like that you aren't convinced that you'll be able to stick to. And it leads to worse reforms to the tax system than you should otherwise be making. I just on this conversation about sort of what led us into this situation, I think too often politics widely, certainly my bit of politics, has disincentivised people from saying things that are interesting, from contributing ideas, from having conversations, having discussions. And I think that really hit an unacceptable point that had real consequences in the run-up to the last election. Lou and I come from slightly different parts of the party, but I turned up to conferences for years, and it was always notable the extent to which the game was always to try and give speeches where you said as little meaningful as possible. You came up with phrases like, we need to have an honest conversation about immigration. No conversation then followed, but we said we needed to have an honest conversation about immigration. Or we said things like, skills were important. Nobody ever engaged in the policy discussion. And the moment somebody did, people in the audience went, oh God, that comes with trade-offs. We can't accept the idea of trade-offs. We can't accept the ideas of downside. We can't accept the ideas of saying something meaningful. And then we entered an election campaign where we pretended, for some God knows what reason, that we all had to pretend like we were holding some kind of Ming vase, which meant that we couldn't go out and talk about a vision for what we wanted in the country. We couldn't go out and talk about who we were for and who we were against. We couldn't talk about what a tax system that incentivised growth, that incentivised creation might look like. We couldn't talk honestly about how some of the regulations in this country were holding people back. We couldn't talk about the state capacity problems that have been limiting economic growth, or just how broken many of those systems are. And that, I think, led to some of the challenges that this government is now facing. And those challenges are great. Just bring me back to my previous point. We cannot sit here and accept as a country, Lou used to work in transport, the home of Isambard Kingdom Brunel, we are now at a point where, because of regulations, because of a limited ability of state capacity, because of everything else, we cannot build a railway line from London to the north. In the country that split the atom, it is going to be 40 years before we build a nuclear power station. And when we build it, it is going to be the most expensive nuclear power station in the history of the human race. You talked about the pages and pages of regulation, and they asked for that. When we tried to build under the Lower Thames crossing, it was 350,000 pages just for the planning process. That's 250 times the length of War and Peace, just for the planning documents. Years and years and years spent arguing over them, and not a single bit of tarmac
had another example that you wanted to raise about that.
Well, just about a key point that we've said, which is that people have been suffering, but they don't just want to be given something in a redistributive way, but they also want to be involved in the solution. So there's a really good example in Camden when Georgia Gould was the leader. We worked together in missions at the local level. We brought people that were across 10 housing estates to help actually design the missions of Camden. We used carers and carees and used their insights to design what I was talking about before, mission-oriented procurement for adult social care. And you see the same thing globally. Like, the reason Biden lost, I think, or one of the reasons, is the economics actually worked, and more should be written about that, right? The economics of the IRA actually had a huge effect, especially in the Trump voting red states. But when people who have been left behind, for all the reasons we've said, for so many years, they also want to feel valued. They want to have dignity. They don't want people like us just to say what's good for the economy. And there's interesting examples, for example, in Brazil, the other Amazon, not Amazon the company, but the Amazon forest, where the indigenous community say, we should be governing and having a say in the Amazon Fund. And when you do that, also in the Camden Wealth Fund or the National Wealth Fund here, and actually listen to the experience on the ground and to use that to design these policies that we're here talking about, I think would go a long way.
Chris, come back briefly, and I think we have to wrap up really quickly.
Just the one point I was going to add on that, because it was included in our pred this morning, but we haven't had the chance to talk about it. The other big obstacle to this, and it's not something that the centre-left has ever come to a conclusive opinion on, but I think needs to, is that too much power is centralised here in Westminster. Now that's, as you say, that is about giving power more to communities, but also that is a massive anti-growth measure. We should not see it as a coincidence that we are one of the most centralised countries in Europe and also one of the ones that struggled so much in growth in recent years. You cannot regulate, you cannot manage a modern economy and have such a centralised economy. We need to start pushing power down.
Give me the last word.
I used that word earlier, the widening jaws between what people are experiencing, what they know is possible. And you gave an incredible example there of nuclear power. Look, I'm not anti-nuclear, right? I think we're one of the biggest buyers of nuclear power in the UK. But not only is it going to take us decades to build the nuclear power stations, long after the current energy crises are over, long after the need for data centres and other sources of new power, not only is it going to be the most expensive power in the world, but it's going on bills today, right? So while we are in a cost of living crisis, the number one issue, by the way, for voters is cost of living. Within that, number one and number two is always energy bills. We are hiking energy bills to pay for a fantasy future when, frankly, like, look, for me, one of the most telling experiences of my recent career, I was in China 2 years ago, and I met one of the Chinese companies that builds wind turbines. And their turbines are 40% cheaper and better than European ones. And I asked about lead times. And they said, do you want China time or Britain time? I said, well, what's the difference? And they said, China time, we can start installing them in 3 months. I said, what about Britain time? They said, give us a call in 6 years, right? And that is the gulf between countries that are getting on and building, for example, in this case, cheap, clean energy available within the time we need it, and countries that are mortgaging the future for stuff we won't be able to afford, and frankly, by the time it comes in, we won't need it.
And on that incredibly positive note, thank you very much, all 10 of the panel.
good to see you all again. Look, our next speaker needs no introduction, but I'm going to try anyway. Look, as we face a world full of turbulence, war overseas, energy security has rightly taken centre stage. From Ukraine to Iran, building British energy resilience has never been more important. But for this speaker, he has held a long-standing dedication to building a clean, secure future for Britain's energy and giving our country a leading role in the race for net zero. Today is no exception as we wait to hear new action from breaking down planning blocks to delinking gas and electricity pricing. But this is a person for whom boldness is not a stranger. From the introduction of the landmark Climate Change Act in 2008 to the headstrong pursuit for fighting for new nuclear, solar and wind farms, to the establishment of GB Energy and groundbreaking developments for small modular reactors, he has been at the forefront of the energy revolution and clean growth. But it has always been more than a moral pursuit. It's an economic and an industrial one. Bold action on energy brings with it stronger supply chains, well-paid jobs, apprenticeships, and strengthened manufacturing, building a competitive and resilient Britain built on our own cheap, clean energy. To me, sounds quite a lot like good growth. And we are very pleased to welcome to the stage the Secretary of State for Energy Security and Net Zero, Ed Miliband.
Well, Praful, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. And can I congratulate you and all of your partners on the National Growth Debate. The Good Growth Foundation is obviously playing a really, really important role. So thank you so much. You've been locked in here, so I bring you some news from Westminster. I was on the way to the Cabinet this morning, and I ran into Matt Hancock. Turns out he loves de-linking because he congratulated us on our de-linking announcement. I thought you would like to know that. It's a privilege to be here at the National Growth Debate, and this summit tackles one of the defining questions for Britain in 2026, which is how we drive the growth needed to raise living standards and create good jobs. Now, in just the last few weeks, this government has signed the contracts for the UK's first fleet of small modular reactors, consented the UK's largest ever solar project, published our plan to implement the Fingleton Review as we take a pro-nuclear, pro-nature approach to building in this country, and we've seen historic investments in hydrogen, floating wind, and wind turbine manufacturing, the latest steps in our plan to work with business and trade unions to reindustrialise Britain. So this government believes that clean energy is the great industrial and economic project for our country in the 21st century. But what I want to argue today, and I warn you this is a bit nerdy, is that it's even more important, our clean energy mission, given what has unfolded in the last few weeks. And I want to make an argument to you in this speech that is threefold. First, as we face the second fossil fuel shock in less than 5 years, the lesson for our country is clear. The era of fossil fuel security is over, and the era of clean energy security must come of age. For Britain and so many other countries, clean energy is now the only route to financial security, energy security, and indeed national security. Second part of my argument is that since taking office 2 years ago, the government has been relentless in our efforts to build clean power at speed and drive electrification across the economy. And while some have said we have gone too far and too fast, I profoundly disagree. Actually, I believe the opposite is true. In response to recent events, our actions must now be faster, deeper, and more wide-ranging if we're to protect our security. We have not a moment to waste. And that's why, as I will explain today, we will double down, not back down, on our mission for clean energy. Third, I'm not going to let Britain learn the wrong lessons and have us end up back here all over again. The North Sea is an important resource for our country, which we will continue to use for decades to come. I do not agree with those who say we should turn off the taps overnight. But nor do I agree with those who suggest that somehow drilling every last drop will take a penny off bills or give us energy security. Indeed, an answer to this crisis that rejects clean energy and doubles down on fossil fuels is a recipe for energy insecurity in perpetuity. You can't solve a fossil fuels crisis by doubling down on fossil fuels. So let me now take you through the argument. First, it's now clear that the world faces a second fossil fuel shock of this decade. The most important objective remains working for a permanent ceasefire and getting shipping flowing through the Strait of Hormuz. But even if we do that, recent events will reverberate across oil and gas markets, at least for some months to come. Now, from the moment this conflict began, our immediate response, and indeed responsibility as a government, has been to fight people's corner in the face of global events. Because we know it is ordinary working people who are most exposed to the impacts of this crisis. That's why, following our action that reduced the energy price cap in April, we've worked to help vulnerable families and expanded bills support to thousands of businesses. And however long this crisis goes on for, we will continue to support families and businesses and intervene where necessary. But, and this is the main point of this speech, we're also determined to learn the right lessons of what we've seen in the last 4 years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine caused global energy prices to surge and did huge damage to family finances, business finances, and the public finances, frankly, from which we are still seeking to recover. And here we are all over again. The same story of events around the world threatening families and businesses at home. And here's the thing you've just got to make a judgment about. All of us have to make a judgment about. I believe this is for one simple reason. Because Britain is so exposed to international fossil fuel markets. We're exposed in our electricity system because 30% of generation comes from gas. And even more so, and I'll come on to this, because even when we use renewables and nuclear, gas often sets the price. We're exposed in how we keep our homes warm, because around 90% of families rely on gas and oil or oil for their heating. We're exposed in our businesses and industry, because around 70% of industrial processes also rely on fossil fuels. And we're exposed in how we fuel our vehicles, because around 90% of cars on our roads run on petrol or diesel. And the reason this leaves us so vulnerable is because the price of these fossil fuels is set on the international market, regardless of where they come from. This is the fundamental energy and economics lesson of this crisis. Now, truthfully, this has been a huge drag on growth and living standards for decades, because half of the UK's recessions since the 1970s have been caused by fossil fuel price shocks. And now a more dangerous world increases the risks. To ignore one fossil fuel crisis and carry on with business as usual, as some wanted to do, was wrong. To ignore two in less than 5 years will be completely irresponsible, and it will be even more irresponsible, because unlike the twin fossil fuel shocks of the 1970s, there is now a compelling alternative in the form of clean energy. An alternative that cannot be disrupted by foreign wars, because it comes from our own wind, sun and nuclear resources, that isn't subject to global price shocks, because it is locked in at stable prices here at home, that can create hundreds of thousands of good jobs and indeed drive economic growth, a big concern of the Good Growth Foundation, obviously, as we use more efficient electrified technologies, and an alternative that will help tackle the climate crisis to protect our children and grandchildren. Indeed, we already see, and this is really, really, I think, an important and maybe overlooked part of the debate, we already see how clean energy is helping protect Britain and other countries during this crisis. Since 2010, homegrown renewables in the UK have gone from generating around 7% of our electricity to over 50% today. If the last government wanted to, they could, if the current opposition Conservative Party wanted to, they could claim some credit for this, but they don't fancy that in their new guise. Independent analysis shows these renewables have cut the wholesale price of electricity, and this is a very important report, I think I should give them credit, I think it's from the ECI, have cut the wholesale price of electricity by up to a quarter in recent years, helping shield us during this crisis by displacing volatile gas. And around the world, we see how different countries are insulating their economies, like Spain, which has doubled its wind and solar capacity since 2019 and dramatically reduced the influence of gas on power prices. France, which has responded to this latest crisis with a plan to double investment in electrification, and Pakistan, which has seen a solar boom in the years since the invasion of Ukraine. So around the world, a new paradigm of clean energy security is emerging. And informed by the lessons of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with a mission, and I should give credit to the godmother of missions, Mariana Mazzucato, who's with us, established when we were in opposition. In the UK, since we came to office, we've been putting the full weight of government behind making Britain a clean energy superpower. This mission has always had two parts: driving to a clean electricity system, but also electrifying as much as we can as we decarbonise the wider economy. Now, my department has been driving this mission at full pelt since July 2024. And I guess it won't have escaped your notice that for nearly 2 years, this mission has been opposed by a coalition of naysayers and defeatists. And that's how I characterise them anyway. A coalition who would leave us vulnerable and exposed, a coalition that has been proved wrong yet again by this crisis. Because recent events show once again why this mission is the energy security, business, and indeed growth imperative for this country. And as I said at the outset, while some think we've gone too fast, I disagree. I think the overwhelming lesson of this crisis is we need to go faster still. Because every solar panel we put up, every wind turbine we build, every heat pump we install, every EV on the road makes our country more secure. So that takes me to the second part of my remarks, which is how we need to go faster. And there's three parts to this. First, we're going to speed up the drive for clean power. In less than 2 years, we've secured enough clean homegrown power for the equivalent of 23 million homes through 2 record-breaking renewables auctions. And we've got business folk in the room. Thank you to them for being part of that process. It's really, really important. We've invested in the biggest nuclear building program in half a century, something I am incredibly proud of. And relentlessly broken down the barriers in the way of building, from planning reform to fixing the dysfunctional grid queue. And in the first weeks of this conflict, we announced we would step up these efforts by bringing forward our next renewables auction to July. Today, we're going even further. Building on public land offers a huge opportunity to fast-track the rollout of renewables in this country, and for too long, we failed to seize this opportunity. So my department is going to work hand-in-hand with Great British Energy, the Ministry of Defence, Network Rail, Forestry England, and other public landowners to build wind, solar and batteries. Honestly, this is a no-brainer. We've got vast amounts of public land that could be used to make us more secure and generate revenue. So we're going to harness untapped public assets, from railway warehouses to unused brownfield sites, to significantly expand the pipeline of renewables. I'm sure there are people in this room who've got ideas on this. We'd love to hear from you. We think this could unlock around 10 gigawatts of capacity. That's a cautious estimate, even using only a fraction of government land. We're also going to step up our work to get critical clean energy projects built across the board, including accelerating the vital grid infrastructure we need. And look, the stakes couldn't be higher here. Every irrational bureaucratic obstacle in the way of clean energy leaves us more insecure as a country. I won't go through all of the package of very detailed reforms today, but we're setting out a whole package of them to get the grid we need built, from land access rules to network consenting, as well as plans to extend permitted development rights and expand self-build for grid connections. And it goes to sort of my view about this, which is it's like the British cycling team philosophy, which is every incremental gain makes a significant difference. We're going to leave no stone unturned as we mobilise the power of government to build this infrastructure at speed. Second, though, and maybe this is the part of our mission that's had less attention sort of publicly, even this isn't enough, because if we continue to use fossil fuels to heat our homes and businesses and power our vehicles, we will remain exposed. So we also will accelerate our efforts to drive electrification across the economy. Even before the Iran war, we were seeing record demand for technologies like rooftop solar, batteries, heat pumps, and electric vehicles. And in the teeth of this crisis, for totally understandable reasons, demand for them is surging. Octopus, you had Greg on earlier, report that solar panel sales rose by more than 75%. Sounds like an advert for Octopus, this. Rose by more than, there are other companies available, rose by more than 75%. And heat pump sales, I did write it, but, and heat pump sales doubled between February and March. And March was the best month ever for EV sales in the UK. Now, before this crisis, it was already often cheaper to run an EV than a petrol or diesel car. But last week, we had very, very exciting news, which I suspect the nerds in the audience, that's probably all of you, will know, which is Auto Trader said new electric cars are now on average cheaper to buy than petrol cars for the first time. That is a big moment. It's a sort of crossover moment that people have been talking about. And with the right tariff, running a heat pump can be cheaper than a gas boiler. I just want to sort of say this, just in all candor. No matter what some people would have us believe, solar panels, heat pumps and EVs are not woke or a left-wing conspiracy or even a Marxist plot. They're actually common sense. And opponents of clean energy want to stand in the way of what the British public want. The difference is we want to support them in this endeavour. And we're also determined, and this is very, very important, to ensure everyone, not just the richest in society, can see the benefits. That's why earlier this year we introduced rules to ensure new homes are built with solar and clean heating as standard. The so-called Future Home Standard is incredibly important, and people have been waiting a long time for this, alongside the biggest public investment in home electrification in history through our £15 billion Warm Homes Plan. This is the important social justice element of this mission. We also want to do everything we can to protect families before next winter. And this is just the start of what we're doing today, bringing forward £100 million of funding in addition to existing plans to upgrade tens of thousands more social homes this year. We also know that families and small businesses use heating oil and LPG, have been particularly exposed to rising prices. So building on the success of our £7,500 heat pump grants, we're announcing a supplement available for those reliant on heating oil or LPG, bringing it to £9,000 for the duration of the coming year. Something I'm really, really excited about, and I'm sure you are too, is plug-in solar in outside spaces. It offers an incredibly exciting opportunity for consumers to benefit from clean power. 500,000 families installed it in Germany last year alone, and we're going to bring it to the UK later this year, and we are absolutely motoring on getting this into the shops. But it's also worth saying we recognise cost isn't the only barrier consumers face. So today we're also announcing we're removing barriers to on-street EV charging, and we're continuing with our record rollout of charging infrastructure alongside the 2030 phase-out date for new petrol and diesel cars. There's lots of other important announcements we're making today, like more solar on rooftops of schools, which I'm working with my colleague Bridget Phillipson on, to help schools to cut their energy bills and transfer money into frontline teaching. Okay, so that's the second part of my remarks, spreading electrification across the economy. Third, there's another crucial element, this is the bit you've all been waiting for, of ending our dependence on insecurity, and that is on delinking. As we get off fossil fuels, we must also break the link to them in our electricity prices. The structure of our energy system means that today volatile gas usually sets the wholesale price of electricity, meaning that at those times many renewables and nuclear generators get paid the gas price. And at times of crisis, like now, this compounds the impact of fossil fuel shocks on families and businesses, and indeed drives large windfall profits for some electricity generators. Now, it's important to say this. We've already moved from gas setting the price, because that's the big thing that matters here, of electricity around 90% of the time in the early 2020s to around 60% today. And thanks to our clean power mission, we estimate gas will set the wholesale price around half the time by 2030. But in addition to that, by building clean power, we're expanding the proportion of generation on long-term fixed-price contracts, that's CFDs, from around 20% today to over 60% by 2030. That's partly because of our pace, which is crucial because it helps break the link with volatile gas even further. But we've concluded that evolution in breaking the link is not enough. So today, the Chancellor and I set out how we will take this further. From next year, we're going to seek to transfer legacy low-carbon generators, which supply about a third of our power today, onto fixed-price contracts that deliver value for money for consumers. Now, this is going to be I want to be clear about this. This will be a voluntary decision for those generators, but because of the tax decisions the Chancellor is announcing today, both extending the EGL, the electricity generator levy, and raising the rate, we will significantly change the economic incentives for them to do so. Together, these measures will accelerate the delinking of gas and electricity prices, making funds available to support families and businesses with the impacts of this conflict on the cost of living. Look, for too long, governments have failed to grapple with this challenge of delinking. This government is taking decisive action. Third part of my remarks. As we learn the right lessons from this crisis, we must avoid learning the wrong ones. There's been a lot of debate about the North Sea in recent weeks. Some people say we should cease all drilling and turn off the taps. I disagree with this position. Others say we should drill every last drop. I also think this is the wrong position. As set out in our manifesto, this government is pursuing what I believe is a sensible, pragmatic course. Production for the North Sea is an important and valuable resource, and its workforce is a vital asset for the country. That's why we're harnessing our domestic supply by keeping existing fields open for their lifetime, decades into the future, and as announced in our North Sea Future Plan last year, enabling tiebacks for these fields through our transitional energy certificates. And today, in advance of legislation, we're publishing further details on transitional energy certificates to provide greater certainty and clarity for industry, looking to invest in already explored areas near existing licensed fields, supporting a fair and managed transition. Some people will oppose this policy, but I think they are wrong. Our position is rooted in a plan for a just transition and a fair-minded analysis of what the science demands. Now, on the other side of the argument, from those who would turn off the taps, there are those who say we should drill every last drop. And I just want to talk about this position and why I disagree with it for a minute. Because I think this position relies on a series of myths which the evidence simply does not support. First, drilling every last drop will not take a penny off bills, because fossil fuels are sold on global markets no matter where they are produced. And North Sea production is simply too marginal to make any difference to this global price. Don't take my word for it. It's what Conservative ministers said repeatedly in the last Parliament, and the Leader of the Opposition was forced to admit last month. Second, drilling every last drop cannot give us energy security. The North Sea is a mature and declining basin. Production in the North Sea has already declined by 75% over the course of this century, and it no longer has sufficient resources to meet our needs. As a result, we've been net importers for 20 years. New exploration licenses, which we are ending, would, as the independent National Energy System operator says, make no material difference to capacity and therefore security of supply. And the industry itself recognises that the vast majority of potential North Sea future production comes from existing fields. Indeed, according to analysis from the North Sea Transition Authority, fewer than 10% of exploration licenses issued in the last decade have progressed to active production at all. But third then, some people have said that despite the fact that new licenses won't lower prices and won't give us energy security, we should issue them anyway. But in saying this, they would just ignore the reality of the accelerating climate crisis, which is the greatest long-term threat multiplier we face. You see, every piece of credible scientific evidence says that if every country took the approach and drilled every last drop, it would take us to global warming well past 2 degrees to 3 degrees and more. And this view of the dangers of unlimited fossil fuel extraction, it's not just my view, it's supported by the International Energy Agency and the respected Energy Transition Commission, which includes members from the energy industry. And by providing global leadership on this issue, Britain has helped assemble a coalition of 82 countries at COP30 committed to the transition away from fossil fuels the world desperately needs. So I just want to be very clear about this. I will not betray the future generations of this country by acting on the basis of myth, falsehood, and misinformation. Faced with the two positions of every last drop and turn off the taps, we will maintain our pragmatic, sensible position for a managed transition in the North Sea. And we will also stand firm against those who want to abandon our clean energy future. You see, when Reform and the Conservative wage war on clean energy, we should be clear about what this would mean. Our opponents would leave us more exposed and more insecure. The National Energy System operator, and honestly you should all read this report because it's on gas security of supply, is very clear that falling behind on net zero presents the biggest risks to our energy security because it leaves us more dependent on gas, including imports. Our opponents would also deprive us of cheaper, cleaner power. They told us to cancel the AR7 renewables auction, which is going to supply power to the equivalent of millions of homes, and secured renewables at prices 40% cheaper than building and operating new gas. And they would destroy jobs. We've seen over £90 billion of private investment pledged into clean energy since this government came to office. And waging war on clean energy will put hundreds of thousands of existing jobs in clean energy, as well as the hundreds of thousands of new jobs we're creating, at risk. And all the while, they would take the risky path for our economy, our country, and our finances. given the Climate Change Committee, and this is an excellent piece of work they did, shows a single fossil fuel shock could cost as much as the entire additional investment required to reach net zero between now and 2050. So, to sum up, as Britain grapples with a more uncertain and insecure world, there are two paths opening up in this debate, in my view. Between doubling down on a future built on the rock of clean power and electrification, or retreating to the comfort of false solutions that would do nothing for our security and leave us brutally exposed. And I do urge people of all political parties and none to reject the path of false solutions and instead work with us to electrify Britain and build the clean energy future that is in our grasp. And let me close by saying this. Over the last 2 decades, Britain has been through crisis after crisis. The financial crash, COVID, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and now the impact of conflict in the Middle East. The question facing us isn't simply how to avoid a repeat of this shock, that's important, but how to build a better country as we do so. I believe the agenda I've outlined offers an exciting, optimistic, and hopeful future for the country, and that really, really matters. Energy and economic security that can withstand this new age of geopolitical instability, warmer homes, lower bills, cleaner air, better technologies, a stable environment for business, good jobs across our country, and doing the right thing for our children and grandchildren. We owe it to the British people to deliver. We can, we must, we will do it together. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Okay.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Secretary of State.
Yeah. Call me Ed, by the way, yeah.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Well, look, Ed, a few quick questions before you have to head off. Look, no one can deny the package of announcements today, the scale of ambition to meet the scale of the challenge.
Yeah.
But, if a member of the British public has logged into the live stream, the question...
I'm sure lots of them have.
I'm sure millions have probably logged in. The question they'll be asking is, when are all of these things going to actually start having an impact in their day-to-day lives? How can you guide them?
Look, sort of straight away, I mean, just take one example of what I talked about in my speech, and there's lots and lots of examples. And it's a particular passion of mine. This plug-in solar thing, I think the reason this plug-in solar matters is, okay, in itself it matters, and just for people who know it, don't know, it became a massive thing in Germany after 2022. Particularly in relation to people putting it on balconies. You just sort of literally plug it in and it starts cutting your energy bills. I think, and I suspect Greg was talking about this earlier in the earlier session, part of winning this debate on clean energy is showing people the benefits, is bringing people the benefits. 57,000, thanks to the money we're bringing forward this year, 57,000 more social housing tenants will have solar panels on their rooftops, cutting their bills. So for me, it is all about, yes, we've got to do the techie nerdy stuff because that's important to facilitate the delivery, but it's all about now, how do we roll this out to people? How do we make it happen to people? And the jobs argument is also a big part of that, because people are seeing things happening in their own area. So the answer is straight away, and I'm obviously kind of impatient, getting on with it, going as fast as we can.
I mean, just there you spoke about the cultural change that seeing the benefits brings. But in your speech, you also spoke about how the populist right is on the march against net zero. Why do you think they've got the British public's opinion wrong? Why do you think they've got it wrong?
Well, it's a very interesting report. I think it's from IBBR about how Westminster massively overestimates the net zero backlash. It's a really, really important piece of work, this, because the British people are seeing what is happening in their lives. And they saw Russia invaded Ukraine, prices went through the roof, businesses face really bad difficulties, public finances, massive exposure, massive costs, and the fear that people will have is it's happening again. And so I think people see it. Now, look, I suppose to bring the first and the second question together, part of my job is to show people there is an alternative that can deliver for them, because people see what is happening. And I would quote the Prime Minister here, because I think this is sort of important. He always says, you know, it's important to provide the help, cost of living help and all of that, but nothing beats the long-term solutions that mean you don't have to intervene to provide the help, because actually people have got the solar panels or the heat pumps or the insulation, things that will make a difference to them. So look, I'm completely confident about winning this argument. Yes, it's a challenge. Yes, there are well-funded forces, but it sort of makes no sense, and there's no rational argument that can answer the crisis that we're facing on the other side, in my view.
You think people are voting with their feet?
I think we're already seeing it, but this is the social justice part. We've got to then roll it out to people.
Well, look, I'm going to ask a couple of questions on the delinking announcement.
Sure.
And I asked this question. One of my most popular videos on TikTok is me lip-syncing while trying to explain to people the coupling of gas and electricity pricing.
Right.
So the first question I would ask to you was a very popular topic. You know, can you explain to the British public at large, in a sentence or two, why this is so important? And then a follow-up question to that. Why do you think you can start this process now?
Okay. A sort of brevity in relation to delinking. The fundamental point is we believe that clean power offers a cheaper alternative to relying on fossil fuels in general, and in particular at times like this when we're on the roller coaster of oil and gas markets we don't control. But so long as the electricity price is linked to the gas price and the benefits don't come back to consumers, there's a missing link in the chain. Now, to be fair, some people get this debate slightly wrong, because contracts for difference provide a fixed price contract, which means the benefits do go to the British public. But as I said in my speech, evolution is not going to... This is not one sentence, by the way. Evolution is not going to get us there. And that's why today's announcements by the Chancellor are important. First of all, raising the tax, because that means that the excess profits that some nuclear and renewable companies are getting from the link to the gas price is reduced, and we can use that money to help families and businesses with the cost of living. And secondly, and that sharpens the incentives for what has got to be a voluntary process, in our view, of getting more generators onto fixed price contracts. So that is the way that we've constructed this. We've been working on it a long time, very much a joint enterprise with us and the Treasury. And it's important, to sum up, because we want the benefits of cheaper, cleaner power to get to people, and this is the best answer we think there is.
The final question from me. You've made some really big announcements on nuclear quite recently as well, SMRs being one of them. In your mind, is nuclear the new backup? Is that the thing that's going to replace gas? And is that why your answer is there on North Sea oil?
Look, I think nuclear is... it's going to be a renewables-heavy system, but nuclear is going to play an incredibly important role. And I think actually, and we've got this very important thing happening, which is the Strategic Spatial Energy Plan, the SSEP, which will be, many people in this room will be familiar with, which is something that the NESO is producing, and they're going to offer the government a number of pathways for where does energy go, and that's a really important evidence-based piece of work. But all of my sense is we're going to need a lot more electricity, not less. If we talk about this electrification agenda, which I've talked about today, if you think about AI, if you think about all of the challenges of electrification and all of the needs for electrification, I sort of think you're going to need all of this. I'm really excited about the potential of SMRs. I'm really excited. We had this amazing trip in North Wales, seeing where the SMR site is going to be, and just the excitement of the kids in the college there about the future that is going to be produced for them. And I suppose to go a bit non-nerdy for a second, I think that's the sort of point I would end on, which is, hope is the biggest thing that matters, I think. and it sounds a bit sort of hopey-changey, but I think it's really important, this. People want a sense, people feel they've been in a long, dark tunnel, really since 2008 and the cost of living crisis. And, hope is the commodity that we have to offer as a government. And I think if you think about this whole agenda, whether it's in relation to bills and the clean tech that can make a difference to people, or in relation to jobs, or obviously in relation to the assurance you get from energy security, all of these things, or indeed hope for the future on climate, all of these things, I think, kind of cohere in this agenda, and that's why I'm so passionate about it.
Ed, Secretary of State, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Salvato, the Chief Development Officer at Liberty Global. And this session really is a great chance to hear the business view on the growth debate and the view of a major UK investor. Andrea, should we start by just sort of getting an overview of what Liberty Global does here in the UK for those who don't know? So if you start by telling us about your joint venture owning Virgin Media O2.
Very happy to. Hi, everybody. Good morning. As Katie said, my name is Andrea Salvato. I'm the Chief Development Officer of Liberty Global, and I've been there since 2005. So Liberty started with our first major investment in the UK in 2013, when we bought Virgin Media for $23 billion. For those of you that know, we then merged that with O2 and created Virgin Media O2, which in 2021, Virgin Media connects about 49 million people in the UK through its broadband and mobile network, and employs about 16,000 people, and we own 50% of that alongside our partner Telefonica, who's the incumbent in Spain. In addition to that, we have also been long-term investors in ITV. We owned 50% of All3 Media, which was the UK's leading independent production company, until we sold that to Redbird a few years ago. And we've also, apropos Ed's recent, the speech that Ed's just made, we've also begun investing in clean energy through a 100% owned subsidiary called Egg Power, where we're generating solar power, primarily for use by Virgin Media, but also for third parties. And we've also started investing in a business that's rolling out destination charging for electric vehicles. So we have a broad, I would say quite a broad and big presence across the UK industrial.
Should we talk about your latest investment announcement?
Yes.
Which was £2 billion into, along with others, into trying to set up a challenger to Openreach that was announced in February, NetOmnia. So what are your plans there, and what stage is that investment at?
Great. So maybe just to give you a little bit of history. So when we bought Virgin Media in 2013, the network covered just under 13 million households. We then started an organic program of extending that network, and we got it up to just under 16.5 million households. For various reasons, we then decided to create a separate joint venture, which we did in 2023, or I think we launched the services in January 2023, where we attracted approximately £4 billion of capital between ourselves, Telefonica, and a French-based private equity investor in infrastructure called Infravia Capital Partners. That business built an additional 2.5 million fibre homes and was competing in this sort of alternative network space, and was a real validation, I think, at the time of how attractive the UK telecoms market was. That market has since struggled. So I think, if you look at the alternative network spaces in the UK, there are too many small-scale providers. They are struggling to raise capital because the cost of capital has obviously skyrocketed in the last 3 or 4 years as a result of inflation across the globe. And so, in that challenging environment, we just announced in February that nexfibre, this vehicle, is going to buy another altnet called NetOmnia, and it's also buying some additional network from Virgin Media O2. By the time all that's finished, it's quite a complicated transaction. That joint venture will still be owned 50% by ourselves and Telefonica and Virgin Media, and 50% by Infravia Capital Partners, and is going to have 8 million fibre homes.
So we should care about this because we
Yeah,
care about the speed of our broadband.
Yeah, it's a big deal on multiple respects. You know, it's really the first big-scale challenger to Openreach, which currently has a dominant market position in providing wholesale telecom services. It's also a big deal because it has, you know, it is going to invest about £3.5 billion of capital in the UK over the next 15 years in terms of upgrading the network to fibre and then connecting people to fibre. Because I think what people forget about these fibre networks, it's not just about building the network, it's also about then connecting the network to people's households. And many of you, you know, will be going through that process with Openreach right now.
Absolutely.
And so I would say in a challenged sector, in the middle of, you know, what is a very difficult time globally, the fact that we were able to raise the financing, you know, almost incremental billion of equity financing and billions of debt financing to both buy the business and then to put the capex in place, to the capital expenditure in place to, you know, upgrade these networks was a very, very positive sign.
And so the CMA, the Competition and Markets Authority, is taking a look at the deal at the moment. Covering tech, I hear so many businesses say that the three letters CMA send shivers down their spine. What's been your experience? And you know, so, I guess it's early days, right?
So yeah, let's, you know, our experience today with CMA has been very positive. You know, we got the Virgin Media O2 merger cleared relatively quickly. You know, we didn't have any issues when we were looking at things on all three media. So the experience today has been very positive. Clearly, right now, this transaction is subject to, as is absolutely normal, a competition review. And so we are going through that process with the CMA right now. And it's obviously very early days because we've just announced the transaction. You know, our view is this is a very pro-competitive transaction. It's not going to impact any competition at the retail level. In other words, the prices that you guys are paying for your broadband are not going to go up as a result of it. And it's going to create a really credible, scaled operator to try and attract wholesale revenue, which is when people like Sky and Vodafone and TalkTalk use your network to provide services to customers. And so we look forward to engaging with the CMA. We look forward to demonstrating, you know, the pro-competitive aspects of this transaction, and we're hoping for a, you know, very quick and speedy resolution.
I said in the introduction, you know, that Britain is Liberty Global's biggest market. You don't have to invest here. What are some of the things that make it a great place to be, and what are some of the things that you're finding challenging?
Okay. That's a great question, Katie. If you step back,
broad, I don't know, but
if you step back and look at, you know, the UK has some incredible structural advantages. It's a big economy. It's on the doorstep of Europe. It is in the right time zone. It straddles the US and Asia, and obviously covers most of Europe with a reasonable time difference. It has a very highly respected and well-known international standard of law called English law, which is, you know, a basis of many contracts internationally. It has a very strong, you know, independent institutional framework and a very strong rule of law. So when you look at that cocktail of factors, it's obviously it's not a surprise that the UK has been a significant destination for foreign direct investment over the last, you know, several 2 or 3 decades. I think, you know, clearly the world has become, as we know, a much more volatile place, both politically and macroeconomically. And, you know, clearly I think there are challenges within the UK that we know well. I mean, energy being one of them that Ed is obviously trying to address. So I think the only message I would give to people in this room is to say we need to double down on those structural advantages. I mean, the other one I forgot to mention, of course, is, you know, the phenomenal university system that is here with all the research and the innovation. I think the UK is home to the biggest number of unicorns, which is, you know, billion-dollar-plus private startups in Europe. Now, Europe lags the US, obviously, we all know that, but, you know, the fact that the UK still has the largest percentage of them in Europe is, I think, it's symptomatic of the structural advantages it holds. But I would say we can't afford to be complacent. You know, the country needs to double down and, you know, focus on it. I think as a long-standing investor in the UK, what we're looking for is, you know, rapid, efficient decision-making around decisions like, for example, this Net Omnia transaction, and regulatory certainty. You know, because obviously when you're making these billions of pounds of investment decisions, you're basing them on a certain regulatory framework. And what's very, very, you know, disconcerting for investors is if there's concern that that might jump up and down. You raised the £2 billion debt and equity to make this transaction. What were the investors saying who were putting money here? Were there, concerns about doing that? Yeah, I think it was, you know, we can't, I think if you were to get the banks and and Infravia on the stage, they would say it was challenging, but I think this particular investment is interesting enough that they were able to get through that. But it's challenging, you know, it's a reflection of the fact that capital is mobile and, you know, can choose where to invest. So, you know, I think it comes back to my earlier comment that we just can't be complacent. What views do you hear from the board of Liberty Global when you talk about making big UK investments? Yeah, they're interested in the sort of the same things that you'd expect a board to be interested. You know, what do we think of the macroeconomic framework? How stable is the regulatory environment? You know, how are we competitively positioned industrially within the so it's the usual questions that a board would ask when you're making these kinds of substantial investments. And do they have any worries that they? No, I would say it's, you know, clearly it's a watching brief, but, you know, no, I would say no, we don't have any worries at this stage. One of the things you mentioned at the beginning was your investment in data centres, which, as we know, have huge energy challenges, particularly in the UK, where the cost of energy is so high. How are you thinking about that, and is that putting you off making more forays in that area? No, so Liberty is split into two main businesses. There's the telecoms businesses that we have, which Virgin Media O2 sits in, and we also have this growth portfolio where we have these investments in things like the energy businesses in the UK, Formula E, which is the single-seater electric car version of Formula One, etc. And so, you know, I think that within that growth portfolio, we have also invested in some data centers, which has obviously been a terrific investment over the last several years and has, you know, recently been fueled again by AI. No, I think the core issue with the data center business is the issue that you'll have heard many times, which is they're very, very energy hungry. And so, you know, there is a big concern where you are in terms of where you might invest to build these data centers as to how you get the energy. Can the grids cope with the load? So I think it's, you know, we've seen people make announcements in the UK and then pull out because they're concerned about energy, which I think is obviously, you know, part of what Ed is trying to address. So, yeah, energy has become one of the big foundation lenses that people look at data center investments through. Absolutely. I mean, certainly OpenAI, as you said, you know, were one of those who pulled out very publicly of their data center investments. But I would say it's not, you know, the energy issue is not unique to the UK. I think most countries around the world are trying to figure out how to balance attracting and maintaining their existing data center businesses with maintaining, you know, how they fuel them with energy. You mentioned some of your other investments across Europe. When you look across Europe, are there any governments you think are doing things really well, sort of making it more attractive for investors like you that we could learn from? You know, I don't want to be, I wouldn't want to, and we operate in the UK, in Ireland, in Holland, and in Belgium, and we used to operate in Switzerland. I would say that the countries that are doing well have stable frameworks, you know, so, you know, they can attract long-term capital and people can invest in them. I would say that's, you know, if I was to step back and look at that, and obviously they're very focused on running a fiscally prudent, you know, balance sheets. So it comes back to the same point that, you know, when you're investing this sort of money, you just want certainty. I know you have lots of private conversations with the Chancellor, but is there anything that you want to say publicly in terms of asks for her, for the government to create that sort of stability that you're looking for? Yeah, we are, you know, I would say we've been long-term investors in the UK. We will continue to be long-term investors in the UK. This transaction that we've done to build this 8 million fibre business is another long-term commitment, multi-billion, multi-year long-term commitment that we're making. And, I would simply, just ask her to help us get speedy decision-making and to have regulatory certainty as we go forward.
And how are you juggling the current state of geopolitical instability? I mean, it's a difficult world to operate in.
You simply, I think what we do is we simply try to build, we look at these businesses and we build and we invest in these businesses for the long term. And you have to create, so I'd say a long-term investment framework, build high-quality businesses, invest in them, and, they will ride through cycles. And the second issue, which I think is apropos the conversation we've just had about the UK and our investments here, is you need scale. In order to be able to ride through geopolitical volatility, energy prices bouncing up and down, inflation going from 0% to 5% and then back down again, you need scale.
And volatile presidents?
I'm not going to comment on that.
Thank you very much, Andrea. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon.
My pleasure.
Everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Very quick announcement. We're just going to take a couple of minutes before we go to our next In Conversation. So just hold on tight. We'll be with you in a couple of minutes. Thank you. again, everyone. Hello, hello, hello. So our next guest is the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and of course, Minister for Intergovernmental Relations, Darren Jones. He joins us today from Number 10 with a reputation as a formidable operator in Westminster, and he is, of course, the man who took on the Horizon scandal as chair of the Business and Trade Select Committee. Not to mention the first Darren to be elected as an MP. We will be putting Darren to by far his hardest challenge yet, a sit-down interview with the one and only Anne McElvoy. Anne is, of course, known for an illustrious career in journalism and podcasting. She's executive editor of Politico, and I'm sure you've all listened to her on your morning commute on Politics with Sam and Anne. So please welcome to the stage Darren Jones and Anne McElvoy. Thank you.
Wow, well, thank you from both of us, I think, for that glowing introduction. I think we just call it a day now. We're going to quick while we're ahead here. We've got half an hour with Darren, who's taken time out this particularly busy time. So we're just going to dive straight into it, Sam and Anne style, just with no Sam today. So, I mean, Darren, the news of the day is clearly, at the moment anyway, is the Ollie Robbins hearing, and you've been at the heart of this operation. You know how government works, and you know how it works in the hubs and spokes and the complexity of decisions. Now, when the former permanent secretary at the FCDO says that the big problem in the Lord Mandelson vetting was a dismissive approach, an atmosphere of pressure, a very strong expectation that Mandelson should be gotten to post into America as quickly as possible. Shouldn't the Prime Minister take responsibility for rushing an appointment of this magnitude?
Good afternoon, everyone. Great to be with you. Look, I'm not going to cast judgment on Ollie's evidence to the Select Committee. I obviously was not a minister at Number 10 at the time and have not been in the Foreign Office, so take Ollie at his word. I think, though, there have been a few procedural challenges that have been raised as part of this. So when I found out about the story on Thursday afternoon, I was out campaigning in Southampton with some of my colleagues when the Guardian news story broke. I came straight back to London for a briefing on the situation, and one of the things I was told was that the Foreign Office had this right to take a different view to UK security vetting, and that had been an established process for many years. But that there was no requirement or obligation to tell ministers or the centre of government when this right is being exercised. So I've suspended that right immediately as of Thursday evening. We're going to be doing a review of it. But that is really the nub of this issue, which is that due process was followed.
You're sure that you're legally solid on being able to suspend that overnight, because the government you're serving has got itself into a bit of an embarrassment?
No, I was able to suspend it immediately because it was a functioning of government question. And until I could satisfy myself that, one, there were appropriate safeguards around this right being used, there's some legitimate arguments for it to be used, but I think the audit and accountability requirements are ones that need to be fixed.
But shouldn't the Prime Minister take more responsibility for this rushed appointment? Because there's a lot of processology, and people who've enjoyed, or not enjoyed, but whose professional interest is in following these things will maybe want to take a view of it. But for a lot of people, it will simply be, this could look like a leader of the country who's hiding behind process, behind excuses, behind his own anger and his response to what he wasn't told, to deflect from a clear lack of judgment, and a sort of duty of care for the country and for the security of the country, as it turns out when we saw what the result was of that vetting.
I think there's a bigger question, and then there's the narrow question about the security and vetting process. On the bigger question around the judgment to appoint Peter Mandelson as ambassador to the United States, the Prime Minister's been very clear that he got that wrong. He's apologised for that. Now, there's then lots of procedural questions underneath it, but to go to the heart of your question, the Prime Minister agrees with you that it was wrong for him to have appointed Peter Mandelson, and he regrets doing it, as you would expect in the circumstances.
But I'm not clear from what I heard yesterday from the Prime Minister that he regrets the way, the culture that Ollie Robbins described
which is a kind of personal fiefdom, perhaps a favouritism, even a recklessness in the operation?
Again, I wasn't in the building at the time, so I can't speak to it contemporaneously, but my experience of being in Number 10, especially with the officials that support and serve the Prime Minister, is that their job is to support the Prime Minister to get the job done and to make sure that these things are being done properly. Now, there were serious process failings here, there's no denying that. But do I recognise the challenge now that the culture of Number 10 as it exists today, and since I've been imposed as a minister in Number 10 is a culture of fiefdom or fear, I just don't recognise that.
You don't? So what needed to change? And is there anything you've heard in the last couple of days, either in the questioning of the Prime Minister in the Commons or from Ollie Robbins today in the committee, that makes you think, one of your deep interests, and in fairness, we have covered it, we've talked about it certainly a lot on the podcast and in all of our reporting about you wanting to remake the civil service, but if your aim is to remake the machinery of government, haven't you just seen something that tells you that your task may be more daunting than you had realised?
Look, I think fixing the state is difficult. Constitutionally, all of these organisations are their own independent organisations, accountable to Parliament. It's kind of a group company. It's not one organisation. So there's no denying the scale of that challenge. But my observation, and I want to kind of distinguish between the civil servants and the civil service here, because all of the individuals I work with are people who come into public service for the right reasons and are as frustrated by the system as the politicians. But I think there's probably a shared view that the civil service, the way it is structured, is not fit for the modern age. And quite frankly, in the context of the next election, we either have to fix that to make sure we have a modern state delivering on people's priorities for the country, or we risk populist politics tearing the whole thing down and anarchy coming in place.
Would you accept that what you would call populist politics, I guess, we're talking here about? Reform, but you mean left and right populism or just right?
Yeah, I see a lot of similarities between the Green and Reform, so I refer to populism.
Wouldn't you say they've had a pretty good week for their politics, given what they've seen? If this is what centrists can do, why not give the others a fair kick at it?
Well, the question for those parties is what would you do differently, and is that something the public will agree to at an election? I think their recipe for the state is to tear it down and leave you on your own, and if you do well, then good for you, and if you don't, not our problem. That's not the type of country the Labour Party wants to build.
You do want to see a reformed civil service. You've just reiterated that. But what message could it possibly send that Ollie Robbins has basically been sacked for what he was tasked to do, which was, after all, to get this appointment over the line? It was already underway. We heard about all of that. He's described that push. But why would officials trust the process of relations with ministers after this? Would you accept it's done some damage?
Well, look, there was clearly a question somewhere in the system in relation to the judgment on whether to raise this issue or not with ministers, not just the Prime Minister at the centre of government, but with the Foreign Secretary at the time and currently the case. And one of the things that troubles me the most is that this was not an isolated decision not to inform ministers. There was a compounding problem. I mean, the fact that the current Foreign Secretary signed off a letter giving evidence to Parliament on exactly this issue, and officials deemed at the time it wasn't appropriate to tell the Foreign Secretary what happened. I mean, it's baffling. So it's not that it's an isolated issue. There was an ongoing decision not to inform ministers.
But I suppose I'm saying in terms of carrying your agenda forward, do you understand that this, for a lot of civil servants, particularly those in senior positions, who could be asked to carry the can, I mean, what they really see is one of the country's primary, most well-known faces, most respected civil servants across the whole of Whitehall and government, across governments, being kicked out basically for, as he sees it, for expediting exactly what the Prime Minister wanted. It must cause a breach in trust.
I mean, I would just refer to the Civil Service Code. The code is very clear that officials have a responsibility to raise issues of this nature, not least when there's the question of parliamentary accountability with ministers. That did not happen. It's for Ollie to account for the detail of that and for the Foreign Office to try to get to the bottom of it. But I don't think that undermines the good functioning of government, because the Civil Service Code is very clear about how these things are supposed to operate.
We've just heard also from the former Permanent Secretary now, this is some reinstatement after a legal process, that Number 10 wanted to find an ambassadorial role for the PM's former Director of Communications, Matthew Doyle, who was banned from talking to the Foreign Secretary about that idea. fairly bizarre idea, perhaps in the midst of a headcount reduction of very experienced diplomats and at the ambassadorial level of people having to leave our foreign service. Can you understand what was going on there? An attempt Matthew Doyle, who, as it turned out, would shortly afterwards be revealed to have kept going a friendship with a convicted sex offender.
Yeah, I mean, look, this is the first I've heard of the story, so it's not for me to, I don't have the information at hand to be able to say whether that's true or not, or what the circumstances were if it were to be true. So I'm afraid you'll have to ask me a bit later once I've got more information.
But I mean, Ollie Robbins has told the story, so you're not doubting the facts of his account?
Ollie Robbins gave evidence to Parliament, so I take him at his word, but he obviously has more information than I do on that question.
But, but we know, for instance, that Matthew Doyle was sent to the Lords. He was sort of expedited, he was rewarded for his time with the Prime Minister. When the awkward question arose of why that was not rescinded, and I think your colleague Nick Thomas-Simmons has looked at some reform of process and appointments to the Lords when something arises. Yeah, can you understand that this makes people think there's a fiefdom there? It's a bunch of legs who pretty much whatever comes out about people who've served this Prime Minister at a high level will be rewarded and anything else will be swept under the carpet, and that saps trust in politics and in this government.
Again, I wouldn't characterise it in that way. I mean, you are right that there needed to be changes made to the peerage processes, which is something that I've instigated now. So the next and future peerage lists will be subject to a much more robust due diligence process, both politically and with inside government, than has been the case in the past. But look, I think the situation in respect of Matthew Doyle, the Prime Minister and Number 10 spokespeople have commented on that situation in the past.
But your own opinion? Do you think it's regrettable?
I think it's always regrettable when these situations arise because, quite frankly, it's deeply frustrating when we're not able to get on with our full energy and attention in delivering the change we promised the public.
So speaking of that change and changing Whitehall, I think I've sat on this stage at the IOD a number of times over the years talking about the remaking of the civil service, what the modern state needs. Everybody knows, in fairness, it's a daunting task. It's one of the hardest that you're taking on, and we'll turn to what your outlook is on how that could lead to higher growth and what the barriers and opportunities that are there in just a moment. But it's also very important to sort of know what you want, isn't it, to sort of get that machinery moving. Now, so you've been in this role doing that. You're a former Chief Secretary of the Treasury, so you kind of know where quite a lot of the bodies are buried. You now have, I think, a slight change of role with Antonio Romeo coming into her post as Cabinet Secretary, and seems to be kind of that some of that driving role has passed to her for the overall reform and driving the reforms of the civil service. I mean, kind of basically, what's the difference, apart from the fact one's a politician, one's a civil servant, between you and Antonio Romeo, and how are you rubbing along?
Well, that's the key difference. I mean, I saw some rather silly stories over the Easter recess that didn't quite understand the difference between a minister, a civil servant, and a special advisor. I cannot be, and do not wish to be, both the Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, the head of the civil service, and the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister. It's not possible for someone to take on all of those roles. But those roles are important to the functioning of the kind of engine that supports the Prime Minister. And so the Cabinet Secretary's objectives, which were published, were obviously reflective of the task that I'm ministerially responsible for, because it's Antonio that operationalises those objectives. And the key thing on civil service reform, and I made this point in a speech I gave recently at the Institute for Government, is that there have been many ministers in my role in the past who have said similar things about fixing the civil service and the state. And the fact is, no one minister can do that by themselves. You need to build a political consensus, ideally on a cross-party basis, and you need to have those shared objectives politically and through the civil service, because this is difficult and takes time, but it is increasingly urgent, and that's why it's right that all of us are leaning into delivering on that task.
How are you getting along together?
Yeah, great. I saw Antonio this morning. We work quite closely together. The Cabinet Office is a very odd department. We have 7 permanent secretaries, not 1, like is normally the case. So I work with lots of very senior civil servants. Antonio's one of them.
Should there be 7 permanent secretaries?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question, but I mean, that's the system
That's
the system I inherited. They're all doing a fantastic job. I mean, there is an.
Oh God, who's out next? I mean,
there is. I mean, let's take the last example. One of the things I've been asked to look at is how we fix the government communications service. Again, really important that we get that right in the face of populist politics and having to show the public that the state can deliver meaningful change in their lives. We hired a permanent secretary to do that in the Cabinet Office, and then made all of the communications directors across government point into him. And that actually matters when you're trying to deal with 28 different organizations across government. So there is legitimacy for that. But all of my senior team, from the Cabinet Secretary to the Permanent Secretary to the Permanent Secretary for Communications and all the others, are all doing a fantastic job.
You're not suggesting decapitating the Permanent Secretary just, while we're on?
No.
No, okay.
Sorry.
Wasn't advocating for it, just thought...
You seem disappointed. No, I'm not.
Well, news is news. Right, let's turn to growth in the economy. Relatively good news today from the government's point of view. Unemployment rate has fallen, partly due to it being term time, fewer students looking for work, etc. And a lot of people actively not looking for work who don't count for some arcane reason in the statistics. But one of the stories I keep hearing, if you go out there and talk to people who are looking for investment in Britain, who are running businesses, who are still concerned about our growth trajectory, is that it's month to month. There's occasional good news, and of course we've got the Gulf crisis, which is outside of our immediate control, but it isn't a steady recovery trend, and yet the outlook for this government, in terms of being perceived perhaps to get out of some of its doldrums, its polling doldrums, its outlook to get re-elected, is tightly tied to that growth project working out. Are you remotely optimistic?
I'm always optimistic. I think you have to be sometimes in my job. But look, there's no denying that the British public need to feel like they are better off and that the country's getting better off at the next election. I mean, that's pretty basic politics. For any party that wants to get re-elected, the public need to believe that you've improved their living standards and improved the country. And they might say, there's more to do, but we trust you with getting on with that in a second term. So that's pretty fundamental to our re-election prospects. But I'm also very conscious that the Labour Party, especially in the context of the civil service reform questions you've asked me about, can't be seen as an old party defending the status quo in the face of rising new populist parties. We have to be a modern party owning the future. And I think a lot of that is about, yes, understanding the week-to-week, the month-to-month data points that you refer to, but also understanding the bigger strategic context in which Britain sits and the British people sit over the years ahead, and being able to make a compelling case for how we are kind of shaping that to deliver better outcomes for people.
We have two big reviews coming forward on welfare. We had the welfare reforms last year, which did not work out, I think we've fair to say, as accepted. We had quite a lot of noises off around defence and defence spending, how on earth this can be afforded, really, without making some really quite clear progress and bringing down benefits bills and welfare spending overall. Or Robertson referred to that explicitly last week when he said he thought defence spending wasn't being taken seriously enough. But do you see any real prospect of getting welfare spending down? It was one of the original intentions, was to do that and then to have that money to spread around for other things.
Yes, and Pat McFadden is doing some important work in terms of how we tackle welfare reform, particularly to try and make it clear that the Department for Work and Pensions is not the Department for Welfare, it's the Department for Work. So we need to be doing everything we can to help people who can be in work to be in work. But we should.
Would you like to see it renamed along those lines? It's a good point.
Well, it already is the Department for Work.
Well, it is, but we still talk about welfare. The government itself, or the Labour government, could change the language about this.
Yeah, I think that's why actually at the reshuffle in September, the Prime Minister moved ownership of the skills agenda into the Department for Work and Pensions, because that's a key enabling policy ownership to help people with that. But look, equally, you can't just put your hand in the kind of pensions pot for state pensioners and spend it on something else. So it's not an easy route out of our fiscal challenges.
Do you think Lord Robinson's wrong about that?
I think he's right that we need to curb the trajectory of growth in welfare spending, particularly amongst young people who are finding it harder to get into work. But I think he's wrong to say that it is an easy route to solving big structural challenges that the country faces, because it's not. And defence spending, energy security, our national resilience of the labour market, especially in a service-dominated economy like ours, with the impacts of AI over the next few years coming much further to the front of our minds, These are big structural challenges, both for public policy, but also for public spending. And it's right that we therefore take the time to understand and do that properly as part of both policy development and fiscal strategy with the budget.
You mentioned AI and the AI-driven economy and its potential impacts there. Some ambiguity about job losses. People are genuinely, I think, very fearful. And also that as AI takes hold of many more sectors, that perhaps things that they thought, well, you know, I'm a middle-class professional, my job will be safer perhaps, but you think, well, maybe not so much. So I'd be interested in how whether you think, you know, how do you think people are feeling about AI when government talks about the possibilities of AI? Are we able really to take on board people's genuine fears and emotional response to it? But also, frankly, you know, in order to drive that, with data centers consuming huge amounts of electricity, we have some of the highest prices of electricity of our peers. So it seems like we kind of want to go ahead. So perhaps paraphrasing you, but I think I know, you know, where you're coming from. We need to modernize the economy. We can't just preach yesterday's economy for tomorrow's world. But you know, we have quite substantial barriers in our way.
Yeah. I think your question is two halves, really. There's one about the labour market and the prospects for work, and then there's about industrial policy and supply chain. On the labour market, look, I see the impacts of AI and technology on the economy as a huge opportunity. We've been debating for years how we improve productivity in this country since the banking crisis in order to improve people's wages and the output of this country. AI is the answer to that. And because we're a service-dominated economy, we know that AI has a particularly good application to the things that we are already good at. The benefit there is that if you've got a state and employers that are helping people to get access to training and skills, to learn how these tools can be used to assist you to be more productive, I deeply believe there is a win-win for workers and for the economy. The alternative is that if you don't shape that in the interests of the UK economy and British workers, you essentially end up with disruption in the UK economy and workers who will be ultimately replaced by AI tools, which is the quickest route to profitability for employers. If we do not make the case for the type of Britain we want to create, the alternative will be the default and is also the one that is on the cards when you talk to other populist parties like Reform. So this is the big strategic question for the future of the UK economy and for work in this country. And I don't see any other party than the Labour Party owning the destination that I've set out.
Would you accept then there are challenges when if we don't put that substructure in place in terms of getting electricity costs down?
Yeah. So
that takes us to the government's energy policy.
Yeah.
It seems to be facing two ways at the moment. If I listen to Ed Miliband this morning, I sort of get 2030 target clean energy. That's got to double down, he said. Not back down, but double down. That man's a phrase maker. At the same time, we have calls for oil and gas exploration and up in the North Sea and the gas fields to be unlocked because we're in a particularly difficult, tight spot because of the Gulf crisis. I mean, which way are we looking on all this?
Well, there are different layers to it. I mean, on energy security, Ed is absolutely right that we need to create more energy here at home where we can control the price because it's a local market decision, not an international market decision. That's why the clean energy mission is so important. For wind turbines floating in the sea or on land or solar or nuclear here at home, we get to set the price and bring more stability to energy prices. But you're right, we also have energy prices, especially for industry, that are too high, and we've got to find a route to reducing that in order to increase investment and productivity in the UK economy. The AI debate, though, is slightly more nuanced than that, I think. The government is committed to trying to secure data centre investment in the UK. That's right, and I support that. But we've also got to think about where does the UK best fit within the whole end-to-end supply chain of the AI economy? What you don't want to do is not be involved at all and then end up just being a rent payer to American companies and to US capital. What you want to do is figure out what are the bits where the UK can really kind of hook itself into the supply chain, capture value here, and make sure that's good for the UK economy and UK workers and for business. And we know from people like Demis Hassabis and others, from Jensen Huang, from NVIDIA, they say that Britain is a brilliant place to invest in technology. But they also say
the electricity costs are high, and that concerns them about investment.
But my point is, where in the supply chain? So we might be able to do some work on data centres, but actually on innovation, on startups, on scale-ups, on building software applications, on building new businesses, on research and development, on the Safety Institute, on the ethics applications. We've got enormous opportunities here, not just to secure that success for the UK, but to lead the world in that part of the space.
Where are you on the Rosebank and Jackdaw oil and gas fields and whether it is a good idea given the extra pressures that have come on to energy and energy costs as we look to the rest of this year and beyond as a result of the crisis in the Gulf. I mean, it does still sound as if, frankly, your Energy Secretary, your colleague Ed Miliband, just does not like this. He thinks it's going in the wrong direction. Well, ultimately, if he has to accept it, it'll be through very gritted teeth. We've had sort of rather different, more nuanced stories, perhaps from close to the Treasury. What's your view?
So I'm obliged to tell you that it is a quasi-judicial planning decision made by the Energy Secretary, and therefore I don't have a view. So I point you to those words. I would, though, just say in the wider policy context, oil and gas will continue to be an important part, both in the energy mix, but also the other downstream processes that are not energy related, but are part of chemicals processes and industrial applications in the UK. The overall debate is how do we transition ourselves into more homegrown, secure energy in the UK? And quite frankly, when you think about the challenge of home heating, this is always the hardest bit of the debate. People will start to buy more heat pumps, and there might be heat networks in new build development, but it's going to take us a long time to get families replacing their boilers when they're end of life with a heat pump. There's no point in trying to push people to do that too quickly because it feeds into populist politics. But as a consequence of that, we're just going to need gas for many, many years ahead, and we may as well get the industrial benefit of taking that from the North Sea if we can.
We had a really great piece, my colleague Carl Matheson, about how hard it was, and he's very committed to this. He's a sort of green affairs and environment kind of guy about how difficult it was to make his heat pump work. Have you got a heat pump, by the way?
No, my house is too old. And so
Have you looked into it?
Yeah, I've got solar panels.
Read Carl's piece.
I've got solar panels, although annoyingly I didn't get a battery, and now I just create cheap energy for the supplier when I'm not at home and pay more for it when I am at home, but that aside. My home is too old, and so I would need to do internal wall insulation, I think, before I got the heat pump, and that's a bit of a pricey process. So I'm probably going to be on my gas boiler, I'm afraid, for many, many years to come.
Right. We'll just get everyone to go. If you've got a problem with your heat pump, just call down. We had some alternative thoughts today, and at all times, right now, we're sort of getting alternative proposals really on the direction of the economy and political economy and what Labour should do. We heard from Louise Haigh. We discussed it in detail on the podcast this morning. I was just going to pull up some of her points. But I think I don't want to say everybody challenging the government from the sort of what's called the soft left, but it seems like a pretty hard movement coming at you guys right now. Whether it's Angela Rayner, it's Andy Burnham, it happens to be Louise Haigh today, effectively saying, look, we're too tied into some conventional ways of thinking about these things. The OBR rules are too tight. We are responding with one hand tied behind our backs. There's just things we could do. We could maybe loosen up on borrowing, etc. I mean, it sounds a bit like, you have kind of backseat drivers on the economy and what it would take to bring back growth. I mean, are these welcome thoughts or noises off?
I mean, backbenchers are perfectly entitled to make an argument for the things they're interested in, and I don't think they're unwelcome. I think it's important that we have this debate because, as Lou mentioned in her comments, the kind of fiscal reality that the country finds itself in is not really up for debate. So what you're really talking about is different types of policies around the edges. There's not an easy answer to the constraints we're under. The economists always get very cross with me, but when I explain to constituents that we've basically ended up as a country where we've got a job, we've got so much money incoming every month, but the bills have been going up, the credit card is at 95%, it's a high interest rate. We don't want to default on that because that will make life even worse. You could borrow a little bit more if you wanted to, but it's going to be more expensive. And you're just trying to get that promotion, reduce your costs, pay off your debt, and walk that tightrope to a more secure future. It's exactly the same for the country, and there is no easy answer apart from the hard yards.
But isn't there a danger when you've got, I'm just citing this morning, we cannot deliver the change people voted for if we're not prepared to change the system. We have Angela Rayner saying we need to be more bold. It's as if, you've got quite a lot of people who are just basically saying that they do see alternatives. Fundamentally, they do sound like they're challenging the Keir Starmer recipe for growth and national revival.
I mean, I'd just say to any parliamentarian, whether they're from my own party or from opposition parties, it's all well and good saying we should be more bold, but what do you mean? I mean, I'm all ears. I mean, if there were easy answers, we would have taken them. And I just think one of the things that I care a lot about is how you explain this to the public in as simple a way as possible so that the public understand the challenges the country faces, what our solution is, and how we're getting on with delivering against that. Now, political debate, the Commons is the place to debate ideas, and I encourage that. But I think everybody coming forward should think about the answer to the question, how?
But they are perhaps being seen in some quarters as an alternative to the leadership of Keir Starmer, just to finish on that point. Do you see an alternative to the leadership of Keir Starmer emerging possibly after the May elections, and also, just looping back with what has been a messy and an unedifying saga?
So I don't, to answer your question, and I go back to the reality of where the country finds itself, the shared objectives to create a more modern Britain based on the values that we care about in the Labour Party of opportunity, equality and aspiration, where we are more richer, fairer and stronger as a country. And as I say, all colleagues, whether from our party or other parties, are welcome to contribute ideas to that. But I think certainly us in the Labour Party, we have a shared objective for the type of Britain we want to create over this decade of national renewal and the fight that's ahead of us in the next general election to make sure that we don't let the populists take control and tear everything down.
The populists you've now mentioned a number of times, you see that as the threat. What makes you think, just looking at this week, that Keir Starmer is really the man who can take this on? It's been quite accident-prone, hasn't it?
I would just say, when Keir Starmer was elected leader of the Labour Party after our worst defeat since the 1930s, and he said to us this was going to be a one-term opposition, I and many others thought, sure, it's probably going to take longer than that given the situation we're in. He secured a historic landslide, slightly smaller than Tony Blair's, which I think he's acknowledged he's slightly annoyed about. And he's one of very, very few Labour Prime Ministers, I think probably the third, to take us from opposition into government. I would not underestimate him.
Karen Jones, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
So our next session is, of course, lunch, which will be served in the room just over there. But can I just remind you, if you haven't filled out the live poll today, it's in your agenda, your brochure, and we are asking what is the biggest cause of the cost of living crisis. Thank you very much.